In the heat of July 1518, the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire and now in modern-day France, was in the depths of a long, hot summer. People walked narrow, uneven streets between half-timbered houses, and the atmosphere was suffused with the smells of sweat and dust, far from the polished visions of medieval life we often imagine. Hardship was an ordinary companion for residents. The threat of famine, recurring outbreaks of disease, and economic strain were part of everyday existence. What occurred that summer, however, was anything but ordinary. It began with a woman, unnamed in the most reliable city documents, but identified in later accounts as Frau Trophäa, though even her name varies across sources. On July 14th, she stepped into the street outside her home and began to dance. There was no music, no festival, no obvious celebration. She danced with a kind of single-minded drive that seemed to have little to do with rhythm or joy, and no one at the time understood why. She danced for 6 days, uninterrupted by rest, simply stepping and spinning as though compelled by forces beyond her own will. Within days, others began to join her. People who had watched at first puzzled were soon dancing too, caught in what would become one of history's most inexplicable public spectacles. The city recorded the spread of this phenomenon with a mixture of bewilderment and alarm. Within a week, more than 30 people were moving in the streets, their arms thrashing, their feet pounding the cobbles until they bled into their shoes. Chroniclers described men and women struggling to stop, collapsing from exhaustion and dehydration in the midday sun, only to rise again and dance. The afflicted were not dancing in festive cadence. Their movements were convulsive, almost spasmodic, and accompanied by grim determination rather than any sign of revelry. Some witnesses reported vacant expressions, eyes lacking focus, and bodies drenched in sweat as though driven by a force outside themselves. At the peak of the outbreak, estimates suggest that somewhere between 50 and 400 people were affected, a wide range reflecting the imprecision of record-keeping at the time, but consistent across chronicled retellings of the plague's peak in late July and August of that year. Some later accounts even claim that as many as 15 people were dying each day from heart attacks, strokes, or exhaustion, though historians caution that these figures are debated because of how few complete death records from the event survive. What is not contested is that people danced until they collapsed, some never to rise again. For the leaders and physicians of Strasbourg, the event posed an unprecedented challenge. Medieval medicine was dominated by the humoral theory, a belief that health depended on the balance of bodily fluids and that imbalance could manifest in any number of physical conditions. Authorities at first considered the dancing an illness of overheated or disordered blood. In their minds, if the afflicted were driven by internal imbalance, they might be cured through movement itself, by dancing the sickness out of their bodies. This belief led city officials to take decisions that, in hindsight, exacerbated the problem. Instead of quelling the outbreak, they built stages in public squares, hired fiddlers and drummers, and encouraged musicians to play so that sufferers could continue dancing in a structured space. Rather than isolating the dancers, the authorities effectively gave them performance platforms. What today seems like a tragic misinterpretation was, in its context, a rational attempt to impose order. These physicians and civic leaders were not acting out of ignorance alone. They were using the medical and cultural tools available to them. Religion, medicine, and ritual were tightly interwoven in early modern Europe. The belief that Saint Vitus, a Christian saint associated with movement disorders, might be involved led some officials to take the afflicted to his shrine in the hope that spiritual intervention could restore them. References to Saint Vitus's dance as a term for involuntary movement disorders endure in medical history, though the causal link between this saint and the Strasbourg outbreak remains a matter of belief rather than documented cause. The astonishing thing about this outbreak is not merely its scale or its physical manifestations, but how it reflects the cultural and psychological landscape of its time. Dancing mania, as it was later called, was not unique to Strasbourg in 1518. Reports from across the medieval period attest to similar episodes in other European towns and cities, stretching back at least to the 14th century and persisting into the 17th century. One of the first widely documented cases occurred in 1374 in Aachen, Germany, and quickly spread along the Rhine and Moselle rivers in waves of movement that resembled mass hysteria more than epidemic disease. Other outbreaks appeared in Augsburg, Schaffhausen, and Basel across the following centuries, affecting men, women, and children alike, with the same unsettling pattern of uncontrolled motion. What links these outbreaks is not a singular biological cause, but a pattern of social, cultural, and psychological stressors that made entire communities susceptible to collective movement. Medieval Europe was a world of recurring hardship. Famine followed plague, war disrupted livelihoods, and religious anxieties ran deep. In this context, bodies may have become expressive sites for social distress, manifestations of fear, uncertainty, and communal pressure that lacked other outlets. Modern scholars tend to interpret these episodes through the lens of mass psychogenic illness or collective stress response, where psychological tension is embodied and spread through social contagion rather than through a physical pathogen. At the same time, earlier theories such as ergot poisoning, a fungal contamination of rye grain that produces compounds chemically similar to hallucinogens, have been proposed. Because rye was a staple food in many parts of Europe, it was plausible to early writers that contaminated bread could trigger spasms and aberrant behavior. However, critics of the ergot hypothesis argue that it does not fit key aspects of the historical record. If ergot were the cause, those affected would likely show other symptoms such as gangrene and more varied physiological damage, and it would be unlikely that so many people would respond similarly to the toxin. The timing and geographic spread across cultural contexts also make a purely toxic explanation less convincing than social psychological models of contagion and stress embodiment. Behind the broad outlines of the outbreak lie countless individual stories of husbands watching wives, of children drawn into crowds, of neighbors trying to pull loved ones from the relentless gyrations. Contemporary accounts do not simply catalog the number of dancers. They describe the raw human experience of exhaustion, bewilderment, and sorrow. Men and women collapsed in the streets, bodies slick with sweat, feet blistered and bleeding, sometimes crying out for relief or surrender. The outward form of the behavior, rhythmic, repeated, relentless, was not celebrated or joyful. It was relentless, draining, and frightening, precisely because no one understood it. By early September, the outbreak finally diminished. Whether it faded due to sheer exhaustion, changes in weather, communal interventions, or some psychological tipping point, the historical record does not specify a clear cause for its end. The dancers simply became fewer, the crowds dispersed, and daily life returned to a faltering normal. Strasbourg's public authorities, having witnessed an event they could neither explain nor contain, banned music and public dancing for a time in the aftermath, recognizing that what had once been used as a remedy had also served as a catalyst. In the decades and centuries that followed, the dancing plague lived on in the memories and lore of Europe. It became entangled with ideas about possession, divine punishment, artistic depictions of dancing death, and medical interest in movement disorders. Some chroniclers linked it to religious transgression, others sought moral lessons about the body and soul. The very term St. Vitus dance became shorthand for conditions involving involuntary motion, even as physicians developed new categories of neurological disorders in later centuries. What makes the 1518 event and the broader phenomenon of dancing mania compelling to us today is not merely its strangeness, but what it reveals about the deep entanglement of mind, body, society, and culture. It invites us to reconsider how profoundly social context shapes human behavior, especially under stress. In a world without modern mental health frameworks, without rapid communication, and without comprehensive public health systems, the body became the most visible canvas for forces that people could neither articulate nor control. The dancers were not simply hysterics. They were individuals whose bodies carried communal anxieties that had nowhere else to go. For contemporary audiences, there is an eerie resonance with our own age. Collective behavior still spreads through communities in ways that defy straightforward explanation. From panic buying to viral social challenges, revealing that humans are not only rational actors, but emotional beings influenced by group dynamics and shared psychological landscapes. The dancing plague, in its literal and symbolic dimensions, stands as a reminder that bodies and societies are interconnected in ways that can be beautiful, tragic, unpredictable, and profoundly human. And while historians continue to debate causes and interpretations, one truth remains clear. The dancing plague of Strasbourg in 1518 was not an isolated anomaly, but a window into the human condition, shaped by stress, belief, social networks, and the limits of understanding in a world that had not yet developed the tools of modern science. It is an event that refuses easy answers, not because it was inexplicable, but because it was deeply meaningful to the people who lived through it and continues to captivate those who study the tangled roots of history.